Daryl James served with the United States Navy for 7 years, and during his service, he was approached about doing some work with a secret space program. He was recruited, taken to the moon, where he spent time there. He signed very extensive documents. Then he was taken to Mars, where he eventually signed up or worked with a German dark fleet known as the Nachtwaffen. And eventually he was rescued or taken away from the service with the Dark Fleet by Nordic extraterrestrials who introduced him to the Solar Warden Space Program.
You're listening to Exopolitics Today with Dr. Michael Salla, your source for the uncensored truth regarding the human, extraterrestrial, global, and political agenda. Click the like button and subscribe to this channel. And now, here's Dr. Michael Salla.
Well, welcome, Daryl, to Exopolitics Today.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me, Dr. Salla.
Now, I just did a brief intro. Is there anything you wanted to add or elaborate to that intro before we get into the actual questions I have for you?
No, it was a good intro.
Okay, all right. So why don't we begin? Now, you told me something in a pre-interview we did about you and your father telepathically communicating and your father having psychic abilities. That struck me as very, very unusual. So, yeah, you want to tell me about that and your kind of background as you were raised?
Yeah, I was probably around 3 or 4 years old, and I remember watching Sesame Street on the couch with my dad, and he said to me telepathically, it wasn't what we called it, but it was just something we could do. He said, "Do you think you'll be able to do this when you get older?" He said, "Your sister used to be able to do it, but as she grew older, she forgot." And I said, "Yeah, Dad, I'll remember." And then I remember he got up and he went to go to the kitchen, and he turned around and he looked at me and he said, "If you can remember how to do this, you'll be able to see your future and the future of others." And then I've met other families as well. I met a family from church called the Hinkleys. They could all do it. And I knew a girl named Jen, who was a friend of my sister's. And it was my sister's birthday on Halloween, and Jen invited me because she would talk to my dad and stuff like that. She knew we were telepaths, and she would talk to myself and my dad. And she invited me over for a Halloween party. And as soon as we walked into the house, she grabbed me by the hand and pulled me into her mother's room. And her mother was getting ready for a Halloween party. She was dressing up something that looked like, Stevie Nicks and Elvira kind of mixed together. And we were all they were speaking telepathically together, and she said, "You say the father can do it?" And she said, "Yes." And she said, "And the mother?" And she said, "Not as much." And she said, "What about the sister?" And she said, "No." And the woman kind of took me by the chin. I was only about 10 or 11, and lifted my head up, and I locked eyes with her. When that happened, it was like the whole room kind of changed colors, like orange and red and like flecks of blue and things like that. And I remember some of the girls out, in the TV room outside of the bedroom were like yelling and screaming. And she kind of shook my head and said, "You're a powerful little boy. You know that, don't you?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "Good, now go play." And that did something to me. I later on found out it put me in the partial fifth density. She did something on accident. She didn't mean to do it, but it happened.
Now, in terms of any kind of psychic abilities other than telepathy, was there anything else that was kind of unusual in your upbringing?
Not in my upbringing, but I remember Jen's mom, she liked me, and she basically kind of wanted me to marry her daughter. Whatever was in my bloodline or whatever, she wanted it in hers. And I found out she was a Kabbalist. The father was like high-ranking mafia in New York, Italian mafia. And I was able to look down timelines, as they call it, like kind of see what my future would have been if I did wind up, marrying Jen. And I looked down that because I liked her. And it just went from, I don't know, I think I was like 16 and she was around 18 or 19, 15. I think I was like 15 and she was around 18. We went to New York, got married, and we had like a girl and 2 boys. And it kind of led up to something like we were in a warehouse one time, and I told this to Jen before she left for New York for good. Like in real life, this is me looking down the timeline when I was younger. And I said, we were in like a warehouse by the docks, and she said lots of business happens in the docks. She's kind of wise to the whole mafia thing. And I worked out. We had a system worked out where the mother would be in another room. I would speak to her telepathically, and the father, the guy who was in the mob, he had an earpiece in, and she would tell him everything that I could see, that was happening during this meeting. And one time, somebody walked in, and I guess he was wise to the things I could do. And I remember I said he has a gun above his right ankle. Like I could just sense that. And as soon as I said that, he pulled his gun out and shot me. And then the father shot him. I remember seeing the funeral. My father died of a heart attack not long after that. And then my mother committed suicide with pills not long after that. And then, my sister was all alone. And I just looked at Jen's mother and I said, I can't be with Jen. I'm sorry. Like, I can't do that. It'll destroy my family. And it was just like, it was very much like living a different life is how it felt like. It was, just different details and things like that I could remember, and I could see all these things. And yeah, it was just looking down a timeline if I would have chose that path.
Okay, so you have those precognitive abilities that you
Yeah.
used in that case. Now, you mentioned that as a child you were tested for your IQ and you got a very high score.
Well, as a child, yeah, I kind of goofed off in school. I didn't have a good attention span, and I found it boring. And so they tested my IQ, and all the woman really said was my mother. I remember, I was very little. I don't know. I think I was about 7. And my mother said, how smart is he? And she said, he's very smart. He's a college graduate. And she just basically said, yes, he's very smart. And later on, in my future, this goes on later on in the story, I found out the exact number of my IQ.
Yeah, well, that's very, very relevant. We will get to that shortly. So, okay, so in 1999, you joined the U.S. Navy. So you want to tell us, what was it that attracted you to serving?
Well, what attracted me was, well, my father just passed away of a heart attack. I really didn't have any kind of aim in my life at the time. I had an uncle that was one of the original frogmen of World War II, and another uncle that was one of the original Seabees of World War II. So I decided to go into the Seabees. And those were the main factors at the time when I joined the Navy.
Okay. And for those that don't know, you want to explain what the CBs are?
Construction battalions. So yeah, I was a builder in the construction battalions.
Okay, so the Navy has these CBs that I guess build bridges and build port facilities for ships that arrive in different places.
Yeah, anything from bridges to like showers, a lot of humanitarian work in like third world countries and things like that. Things like building schools when you're, making new allies with different countries. I've been to Honduras, Lithuania. I went to Iraq. I served in the first Iraq war. Did a lot of convoy security and things like that for civilian construction workers and all those, different companies that were in Iraq at the time.
Okay, so CBs are kind of like the Army Corps of Engineers, the equivalent.
Army engineers and the Air Force, they call them, I think they call them like prime beef or something like that in the Air Force. But yeah, engineers, Army engineers in the Army. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so you mentioned, in 2003 you served in Iraq, and you did all sorts of construction work there. So, yeah, well, what else happened during your deployment to Iraq?
I mean, like I said, it was mostly just convoy security. Right there, we're doing convoy security. Like the different trucks and things like that, where you'd see them all black on the sides and everything like that because they're getting hit by RPGs. A lot of things like that, guarding those civilian contractors. I all over the place. Al Diwania, Al Jabbar, Al Nazariya, mostly the southern areas. I was in the very beginning of the war, so it was just us pushing through into Baghdad.
All right. So you served in the U.S. Navy for 7 years, and you shared, one of your documents there. This is that shows how long you served for. So we just have a redacted version of that, but there we have it. So it just shows that you served from 1999 to 2006. So you get an honourable discharge. Now, at some point, you realise, or maybe you remembered all along, that just after boot camp, you were recruited into something. So, you want to kind of walk us through what happened, and how you were kind of recruited into the secret space program.
Well, I did 5 years in battalion, which is, being deployable, going to Iraq and different countries and things like that. And then afterwards, I went to St Mawgan, England. I re-enlisted for another 2 years in St Mawgan. And it's in the Cornwall area and right south of Wales. And probably the first week I was there, one of the guys came in and said, "Hey, you have to escort some civilian workers into the underground base." And I thought it was strange because I only had a secret clearance and it was a top secret base. And so I went to the quarterdeck, which is kind of like the lobby of the base. And when you went to the quarterdeck, there was like a mag lift there. You saw the tracks most of the time. I think I only saw the actual mag lift twice. It was like a round tube, white, had like a porthole on it. It's like those trains that go all around the earth. There's caverns and, tunnels that go all around the earth, and they go very fast. Once you get deep enough, it becomes a vacuum. They have like a fan system that pulls all the air out, so there's no wind resistance or anything like that against the train. And then next to that was a 10,000 ton blast door that was, I don't know, probably around 15 feet high by about 10 feet wide, 5 feet thick, and it had stencil on it, and military stencil, 10,000 tons. It needed a wheel at the bottom, otherwise it would have got ripped off the hinges. That kind of, when the wheel rolled across like an embedded railroad track as it opened up, a yellow light went off and a siren. So I went to the underground base and, into the quarterdeck, and there were these 3 civilian workers in the corporation Siemens. And there was a sliding glass door that then you walk down the hall to an elevator. Then that was another way to get into the underground base, through an elevator. So when they walked through the sliding glass door, there was something that looked like a metal detector. And the first guy from Siemens said, "I'm not walking through that bloody thing." So I thought, well, I don't want to walk through it either. And I tried to walk around, and there was a guard behind a table, a stainless steel table, and he said, "No, you walk through." So I looked at it, and I just thought it was a metal detector, so I walked through. I had to get escorted by somebody else with a higher clearance than me. I just sat down, watched them fix a pump, and that was the end of that day. And then on Saturday, or no, I had a 0-100 to 4 a.m. watch, like midnight to 4 on a Friday. And I saw Michael Aquino there. He was a colonel in the Army. He started the Temple of Set. He was pretty great. I knew him because I saw him on an episode of Oprah when I was a kid. And he has like the curled up eyebrows, like horns and everything like that. And he was reading some papers on the quarterdeck table, standing up, looking at papers. I think it was my file or whatever that machine I walked through. I think he was looking at that. Yeah, I think he wanted to see me in person. And, I talked to him for a while, sat down, asked me where I was from, things like that. He kind of creeped me out, so I just left and did another round around the base. I was like doing rover watch, is what they call it. And that was the end of that Friday. And then the next Friday, I had another 0-100 to 4 a.m. watch, which isn't common really. It's like only if you get in trouble, because Friday midnight to 4, nobody wants to do that. So I had another one, and there was the petty officer of the watch. He was a bit overweight, blonde guy, blonde mustache, and he was sitting behind the computer. And he pointed at the computer screen. He said, "What do you think about that?" And it would just look like a picture, like a black and white picture of like your stereotypical kind of gray. And he said, "What do you think about that?" And I said, "Did you get that off the internet?" And he said, "No, look." And when he said, "Look," next to that sliding glass window, there was this very big window. That sliding glass door, there was a big window, stopped about 6 inches from the ceiling, six inches from the floor. And it was like an office room behind it. And And when he pointed, I looked at it and it was just right there. And then he said, "Do you mind if it comes in here?" And I said, "Does it mind if I look at it?" And I heard in my head, "No, I don't mind." But he said, "No, I don't mind as well." And it was actually kind of light brown, had like a hue of pink about it, big black eyes, small nose, like really no nose hardly, no ears. It had a fold of skin going from its tear ducts down to its cheekbones. And it walked out, and it had very long fingers. I remember right away. It kind of had to walk like with its hands in C shapes, or it would have drug its fingers on the ground. Long palms, long fingers, and it walked in almost very robotic. And it had something that looked like a silver pistol in its hand, like polished metal. And I just got back to my rack, and I started saying "gun," and it was coming right at me, coming right towards me. And I stood up and I pointed and I said "gun," and they all said it's not a gun. And it kind of put its hand out to show me what it was. And I noticed it was the same guy that was behind the stainless steel table when I first walked in the underground base. And he was behind it, and he had his rifle on his shoulder, and then he had it at the ready, which means he had it like in his hands. It wasn't pointed at me, but he had it in his hands. And so I sat back down, and I sat back down, and it was still walking towards me, and there was this small little Dell computer on the ground, and it was actually a drill. It wasn't a pistol, and it took apart this small little Dell computer very quickly, like a machine. It didn't have to guide the bit in or anything like that. It just hit the screws every time, and it was catching with the other hand. So it was catching all the screws as it was taking this computer apart. Slid the top off, popped out 2 gigs of RAM, put it on top of the table. It was short. I had to reach up, grab 2 more, put them in, slid it back down, and it kind of had to flicked its hand forward, and every time it was able to set a screw in between its fingers when it flicked it forward, and it was able to put it together almost as quickly. And then it just stood there in front of me, and it looked this way. I kind of turned around to look at it, and it moved its head for me, and I was able to see both sides of it. It moved its hands back and forth for me. And after a while, I just got kind of bored with it. It was just standing there, and I was looking at it, and it just turned around and walked back into the underground base. And the petty ops of the watch said, "Do you think you could work around something like that?" And I said, "I don't know why not." I think it was a test to see, like, gauge what I would do, if I would run away or attack it or what. And he started saying things like, "You're smart." And I said, "Really?" He goes, "Yeah." I said, "How smart?" I said, 140, 150 IQ. He said, "More like 190, 195. And then he started telling me things like, "You smoke," because I smoked at the time. And he says, "But you don't have any clots. That's because you drink," because I drank at the time. And I said, "How do you know all this?" And he said, "You see that scanner you walk through?" And he's talking about that metal detector, what I thought it was a metal detector. They called it a scanner. He says that, it scans everything. It finds out your IQ, if you have any clots. It gives you like a complete physical every time you walk through. And these guys who worked in the underground base had to walk through it, every day. And he asked me why I was a CB, and I said, "Well, I had a marijuana paraphernalia charge when I was 19, so all I could do was construction or be a cook." And he said, "Oh, don't worry, that's not going to affect you here." And he asked me if I had any hobbies. He said, "With your scores, you'll be an officer." He said, "You have plenty of time if you have a hobby." I said, "I used to play classical guitar." And he said, "Oh, they'll really like that." And I said, "Who's they?" And he said, "Well, there's Germans up there." And I said, "Up where?" And he goes, "In the moon and beyond." He really didn't call it space. He just said up there. And I mean, he was just telling me just different things. I asked like what they were, and he said, "We don't know." He said, "All we know is they've been here as long as we have." And there was some kind of war we got into where we had outside help, but we participated in the war, and I guess one of the deals or something like that. One of the part of the surrender when they lost was they had to go underground, and they've been infiltrating our religion and our government and our schools ever since. They've been trying to like infiltrate us in different ways. And he really didn't seem to know a lot. He was like a lower level guy, I think, in the program. He said he went to the moon very often. He pretty much stayed on Earth, though. I mean, that was like his 20-year and back. And he said, he asked me if I knew the guy who won the PRT test every year. And it's a physical readiness test. Most push-ups, can run the fastest and everything. And he was a younger kid, around 18 or 19. And I said, "Yes, I know him." And he said, well, that's me. He said, I joined the program. And this guy was like 35. And he said, don't tell him. He said, that's why I have the mustache. It's like a disguise. And so on Monday, the executive officer came directly to the garage, which really doesn't happen. They usually will, come to you and they'll talk to you. I mean, you usually go to their office and they'll talk to you. But he came directly to the garage and asked for me. And I came out. First, we walked outside and we were just walking and small talk. How do you like England? Things like that. And he said, how does it feel? And I said, what? He's like, no, well, he asked me what I thought about, the drone that I saw. That's what they call them, drones, and pretty interesting. And he said, how does it feel to have a 195 IQ? And one of the guys earlier told me that whenever I saw the computer screen, when the first class petty officer of the watch showed it to me, it was like color-coded lines that kind of went up and down a little bit. And so there was one right above me, and I was right below it, and there was a gap in the rest of the guys. So he said, petty officer of the watch told me that I was the second smartest person on base. One of the guys came up to me and said, you know who the smartest is? They asked me what I thought about, the long spindly finger, big black eyes, kind of creepy looking, asked me how I thought what I thought about that. And I remembered as it was happening, I was pinching myself on the thigh when I was witnessing this thing. And the petty officer of the watch said, do you think you're dreaming? And I said, no, I want to have a mark on my body in case you erase my memory so I'll remember this. And he said, no, you'll remember this for now. And I woke up in the morning, I remember I had a blood blister on my thigh. I gave myself a mark. And then I saw this other person who worked in the underground base immediately. And, what did you think? He said, he said, you know who the smartest person on base is? And I said, no. He said, it's EXO. He said, the executive officer is the smartest person. He has an over 200 IQ. And so I was, walking on the sidewalk on the base with him. And he said, how does it feel to have a 195 IQ? And I said, well, you would know, sir. I said, you're only person on the base smarter than me. And he said, oh, so you know, huh? And I said, yes. And he said, well, who told you? And I didn't want to say at first, but he just kept on saying, who told you? And I eventually told him, and I said, but everybody knows, everybody was coming up to me, asking me, why are you a CB? Things like that. And then he asked me why I was a CB, and I told him I had a marijuana paraphernalia charge when I was 19. And that's all I could do was instruction to be a cook. And he said, well, that won't affect you here. And he told me about, he said if I ever heard of Gary McGinnon. And this was like a current event at the time, and it was in Scotland. And he told me he hacked into NASA, the U.S. Army, and the U.S. Navy. And he found files called Project Solar Warden, where he found things like extraterrestrial officers with ranks and social security numbers, pictures of cigar-shaped craft over the moon, and he said it's all true. And he said the only reason they didn't extradite him is because if they did, he would have been able to call witnesses if he went to court and would have blew the lid off Solar Warden. And it was during the Iraq War, so it was pretty easy to cover up. And he said, we have a program called the 20-year and back. He said, we put you in the program, you do 20 years, we send you back in time 20 years, age regress you 20 years, wipe your memory, and you wake up in bed like nothing happened. And I said to him, I can believe in wiping one's memory, and I can believe in going back in time, but there was something about age regression I found hard to believe. And he said, after what you just saw, you find that hard to believe. And I said, well, touche, sir, but yes. And he said, well, it's true. Like, he wasn't convinced. He wasn't going to bother trying to convince me any further. And he said, with your scores, I guarantee you'll make commander and pilot of a 4-kilometer-long starship. And he told me they look similar to the ships in Battlestar Galactica. And I thought about it as I was walking with him. And I said that scanner I walked through, going in an underground base, it could tell if I had clots in my body or, anything. And he said, yes. And I said, well, my dad died of a widowmaker, a heart attack when I was 19. And he had a clot in his heart that we didn't know about, and it just broke off and he died. And I said, if we would have had technology like that, it would have saved his life. I said, why isn't this technology, available to the public? And he went on about population control and everything else like that. And I said, well, there has to be a side that wants to release this to the public. And he said, well, there is. And I said, well, if you can get me on that side, I'll do it. and shook his hand, saluted him, and he said, "One more thing, Mr. James." And he was calling me Mister this whole time as well, which only officers call each other Mister in the Navy. He said, "One more thing, Mr. James. You're going to be escorted by a reptile, and he's big." And I really didn't know what he was talking about because I had no idea about any of these things. And so it just kind of went over my head, and I really didn't even think about it. And then, so that was a Monday, and then I was in the barracks with the guys playing Halo, the video game Halo on Xbox. And they knew I joined the program, and they just started talking about different things. And one of them said, "Hey, did you see that reptile today? We're waiting for another game." And another guy said, "Yeah, he was big." And another one said, "Yeah, he talked funny too." And I said, "What?" I said, "There's reptiles underground that talk to you?"
Draco Reptilian, I just wanted to back up because there was something you said about the gray. You called it a drone. So are we talking about a real extraterrestrial? Or are we talking about a programmed life form? And the second question I have from what you've just said is the guy that was interviewing, or that was kind of like talking to you when you went into, he was at the desk, and you know, and he talked to you about the grey. You said something about him having his younger version out there, and I just wanted to kind of like understand how that could have happened at that same time around 2004. How his younger version could be right there while he's there, you know, at the same time. That kind of was a bit puzzling.
Well, the drone was, they called them drones, and I was told that they were like an organic machine that kind of shared a consciousness, and you can kind of program them with a smart glass pad, like a small computer, and you can pretty much teach them anything from anatomy to taking things apart, to like machinery, computers, things like that, and they can immediately learn something. And yeah, they're almost like an organic machine, pretty much, and that's why he was able to hit the screws every time with like pinpoint accuracy with the bit, and didn't have to guide it in or anything. And the petty officer of the watch, he was saying that, I guess they time travel a lot. So he was, came back in time and was working at the same base where his younger self was just working in the underground base as well. And I remember he scolded this younger version of himself sometimes, like working at the quarterdeck and just, seeing them interact with each other, like, almost like a father to a son. I remembered that. But yeah, like as far as like anything happening, distorting time or anything, if you meet your younger self or meet yourself in the same space or whatever, there's no kind of repercussions for that as far as I know, because yeah, it was just basically an older version of this younger kid that always got first place on the PRT test and things like that. But it was just an older version of him, like 35, because going back and forth in time as they do in the programs a lot.
Okay. Well, yeah. And if you can just resume about the well, actually, at some point you signed a bunch of documents. So was that before you met the reptilian or after?
That was right before. Yeah, I met the reptilian. That was right
Yeah.
before.
So why don't you tell us about going to the moon and signing a bunch of documents and what you remember about the documents?
Well, I mean, about the documents, I remember I came in, it was Friday, and I came in and I started signing. It was a stack of papers, like you were signing a mortgage, and it had X's on it already for me. And that same first class petty officer with the mustache was flipping the papers for me, signed here, initial here, things like that. And I got kind of cold feet, and I was reading it. I was trying to read it at first, and he said, if you read all of this, we'll be here all night. And it was saying things like, I don't know, like the consciousness of the first party now belongs to the second party and things like that, like things I really didn't understand. And it was talking about consciousness. And when I stopped, and I said, I don't know if I should do this. He said, you're already back there, so just sign the papers. So he was saying like I was already back in time, like I had already been sent back in time, and I was being age regressed in the underground base. Like I had already come back, so I was in a time loop kind of pretty much is what he was saying. So I signed the papers. I sat down, and he said, all right, send them in. He got on the phone. He said, send them in. And then, I don't know, a couple minutes later, behind that same big glass window, there was just big reptile. It was very large, probably about 9.5 feet tall. And he had ridges going down his head, kind of like mohawks, flat face, no nose, no ears. His mouth went straight across and then up. He was wearing like a tight blue like uniform, and like I said, 9.5 feet tall. And I remember I stood up and I said, Jesus Christ. And I said, he's not going to eat me, is he? When I said that, I remember the reptile sighed, like a big inhale and a big exhale. Almost like, it was almost like a 9 to 5 to him, like he had seen this before. And the petty officer of the watch said he's much bigger and stronger than you. If he wanted to, he would have killed you and eaten you by now. And I was just kind of worried and just standing there and didn't know what to do. And eventually walked out into the actual quarterdeck and was standing there in front of me in the quarterdeck. And there was like a different guard this time, a younger kid, and he had his rifle out too at the ready. So I just started walking with him. I thought, well, I have to do this. I just started walking with him and went to the underground base. And I remember there were things like, bicycles against the wall and golf carts. Like if you had to go deeper into the base, you could jump on a bike or golf cart. And this guard kept on butt stroking me, like hitting me with his weapon in the back. Because I didn't realize like the situation I was in. I was pretty much a slave, and I really didn't realize it at first. And I said, please stop hitting me. I'm not looking around anymore. Please stop hitting me. I was just staring at the reptile's back, and he kept hitting me. And I was experienced with weapons, and I've been at the range, and I've been a range coach, and I just turned around and I grabbed the kid's weapon because he hit me again harder. And I put my leg behind his and threw him on the ground and knocked the wind out of him. And I said, if you hit me with this weapon one more time, I'm going to shove up your ass sideways. And I remember the reptile said, leave us. But he kind of said it like in a voice where it was deeper than any man could be. And it was almost like when he said, leave us. It was kind of deeper, and then he had to push that last syllable out. And the kid got up, looked around, looked at me, looked at the weapon. I held the weapon out. He grabbed it, and he walked away. And when I turned around, the reptile was standing right in front of me, and he had like all his muscles flexed and everything. And he was looking over his chest muscles. He was very big. And the first thing that came into my head was, I'm sorry what I said before. You're much more civilized than him about, eating me. And they don't have muscles in their face. The only way that you can really tell if they're angry at you or upset is their eyes just get smaller. They kind of squint their eyes at you. He opened his eyes normal, and he just turned around and he said, follow me. And we eventually got to like a catwalk, like 3 steps, and it had one of those sealed doors with like the wheel on it, like a watertight door you'd see on ships. And I went in, and there was a chair there, and it had holes on it and straps. And he said, get in. And when I saw it, it reminded me of like a gas chamber chair. Like I saw a gas chamber chair one time when I was a kid in the DARE program, like in the 80s, to keep kids off drugs and stuff. They showed us like a gas chamber chair in a trailer. And that's immediately what I thought it was. And I saw the sealed door and everything, and I thought, this thing's trying to kill me. So I went to run, and it grabbed me by the neck, threw me in the chair, and it was strapping me in, and I was fighting back to get away. And at first, I think it headbutted me, knocked me out for a second. And then when I came to, my entire right side was strapped in. I was undoing the straps, and it grabbed me again by the chest and kind of pushed me in the chair. And I remember his hand was like, his fingers were up here, and his palm was like right here. That's how big it was. And it kind of threw me back in the chair, and it made almost like a growl that an alligator does during mating season, where you could feel the rumble in your chest, like the percussion, but you can't hear it. And as I got closer to me, I could hear it. And he said, don't make me hit you again. And when he got close enough, I jammed my thumb in its eye, because I was fighting for my life as far as I was concerned. I'd never seen anything like this. And it was very scary. And I wasn't acting rational. And it leaned back and squinted its eye and kind of teared out a little bit out of its eye. And it just leaned forward and collapsed my chest till it pushed against my heart, and I passed out. I woke up, and I was completely trapped in the chair. And I remember he said something like, I'm sorry I have to do this to you. And he walked out and it tightened the door. And earlier, one of the guys in the barracks was telling a story about they're going to put you in a chair, and it's a density chamber. It pushes you artificially from 3rd to 5th density. We're 3rd, but most of the ETs we deal with are 5th density. He said you'll become stronger, faster. Your IQ will go up 200 points, and you'll become more of a collective. And that's what this was. And it felt almost like an out of body experience. It's kind of like cold weightlessness and then like at peace. And then I came to, the straps were undone in the chair, and I saw a man with like blonde hair, slicked back with pomade, like shaved undercut, and he was wearing like one of those black leather trench coats, like a Gestapo. And he was kind of talking to the reptile, but gesturing like he was talking, but not saying anything. And the reptile's back was towards me, and it was doing the same thing. And it was actually a first class petty officer on the base. So the XO told me this later on, where, you know, Germany won World War II, basically. Like, World War II was just a battle, but they won the overall war. We were infiltrated by off-world Germans, is what the military called them. And so they weren't really spies. We were just like a conquered nation, and they were just posing as U.S. Navy. So this guy was like a first-class petty officer in the Navy, but he was actually in the Dark Fleet, Nachtwaffen. And I slid off the chair, and I kind of fell to my knees, and I was really out of it, and everything was completely different. It was just, colors were different, sound was different, everything was different. It was this higher realm of reality, I guess you would say. And you know, your color spectrum goes up, your sound frequency goes up. And he
can I just ask something right there? So that recruitment, I mean, there you are in an underground base in England, you're serving with the US Navy, you go through that chair, I mean, you go through that security machine, and you're scanned, and they make a determination that you're suitable for a secret space program, and you're told about the Solar Warden program, but rather than being recruited for the Solar Warden program, you're actually being recruited for this Nachtwaffen, that they had infiltrated the US Navy and the military to the extent where they would recruit people who would, under false pretenses, that you weren't being recruited for the Solar Warden at all. You were being recruited for this German Dark Fleet.
I was being recruited for Solar Warden, but since I poked that reptile in the eye and were considered so below them, as punishment, I was told later on by the executive officer I was going to do 40 years in the mines of the moon. And what they do is they age regress you, send you back in time to 40 years after you do it, and they don't wipe your memory. And most people commit suicide because they're really hard on you. It's like a special punishment they do. But and that's what I was originally doing when I first got into the program. I was in the mines of the moon for 3 months. I asked the XO about this later on, and then a German officer came up to me while I was in the mines and scanned me with something. I guess he could see my scores were high, and then I got recruited into Nachtwaffen, like the Dark Fleet, after he realized that I had high scores. They want you to have at least 110 IQ to even be in the mines of the moon. Something about the density change. Your mind can't handle it unless you're like above average intelligence. So you have to have, even to work in the mines of the moon, unless it's for a special punishment, they want you to have that 110 IQ just for that, because something about the density shift, the density change is very difficult for people to accept unless you have above average intelligence. So yeah, and then after that, I was in Nachtwaffen, and I did things like, a lot of it was on Mars. A lot of it was getting insectoids, mantises, beings like that. They're very good with DNA manipulation.
Before we talk about Mars, I just wanted to talk about this moon base. So this moon base, you're taken there as punishment for poking that reptilian in the eye. You were going to go serve in Solar Warden, but now you've been kind of circumvented. You go to the moon as punishment. And then at some point, the Nachtwaffen notices your intelligence, your scores, and says, okay, you can join us. Now, I just wanted to kind of point out that this moon base that you say where slaves are taken and where the reptilians have some role, this is something that, I don't know if you have heard of Niara Islay, but she served with the U.S. Air Force from 1981 to 1984, and she says that she was taken to the moon as well as punishment because she saw a spacecraft at Tonopah Test Range, where she was a kind of radar operator, and she was supposed to track this UFO but not see it. But somehow she went outside and saw it, and so they punished her by sending her to the moon. But it sounds like, I mean, either she went to the same place because she described slave labor, being abused, being exploited as a female, and this was all happening at this underground moon base.
Yes, I actually met a woman there that was on the base. She was a nurse. Her first name was April. I guess she joined the program. But there were women there that your only motivation to work was sex. If you were like one of the men, working on the moon, and they had brothels there. And I remember them like taking the babies away from women, as they were nursing them, women crying and things like that. And I found out, if the baby didn't have a high enough score, intelligence score, they didn't think it was going to, be of any use in their programs. They would actually take those babies, and they would. There were caverns. Later on, the XO told me this. There are caverns, like caves, and underneath all underground bases. And in these caverns, I don't know if I'm allowed to say it because of YouTube and stuff, but it's for the harvesting of.
Right. Yeah. We've got to be careful of the YouTube censors here.